When she finally came to Zoran's store, she found that across the uneven cobbled street could be heard the exciting nattering of folk and bustling of bodies as they went in and out of Mrs. Bramble's bakery. She was doing a grand old trade. Edith knew exactly as for why, too. These bloomin' Orbinalls. Over the past few moon sweeps, Edith had become accustomed to pretty much the whole village slack-jawed and ogling the bewitching things. At first it had been a boon to the hog-strutter, but then there were just too many people. Folk seemed to be multiplying, and Edith felt hard-pressed to keep up. A recent spate of monstrously large usk had dried up her last barrel, so she was clean out of ale. And without the poor judgment ale brings, nobody bought her pies any more, either. Now Edith knew exactly why. Orbinalls were glowing with the seeings of baked goods so assorted and handsomely depicted, in the enchanting ways the Orbs had of making some things so commonplace to appear so appetisingly delightful. They were just too irresistible for anyone not to share. "Herbal tea, too? The nerve of it!" Edith muttered as she stood, hands on hips, squinting across the street when gaps in the passing crowd allowed. Through the windows of Mrs. Bramble's bakery, she could see folk sat enjoying cake and drinking herbal tea infusions. "Selling beverages is my job," she witted to herself, feeling a blush of envy flush her cheeks. Bakeries were meant for coming and going, not sitting and sipping drinks. Ensom had the hog's trotter for that. And as if that wasn't bad enough, when seeings of her own food did pop up, it appeared dour and dismal by comparison. So unsightly that even Edith herself wouldn't dare touch the stuff. But that ain't how things are. She had implored her patrons, begged them to see with their actual peepers, not with these Orbinamouth bobs. Yet no one was hearing her. What the Orbinalls presented, folk saw as truth, even when the real world demonstrated otherwise. It was ridiculous, so Edith was going to have words with this Zoran, tell him to pack up, leave town. She had rehearsed everything she intended to bombard him with that morning as she paced about her empty tavern. Now, right in front of Zoran's door, she stood chewing her bottom lip, clenching and unclenching her fingers, working up the courage to confront him. Orbinalls crowded the windows, nestled on a rainbow of velvet cushions. Atop the place, nesting where the chimney of Old Man Clenton's cottage had once been, like some great green glowing egg of an unimaginably mammoth bird, was an Orbinall. So big it was that it would have taken 2 people to bear it in open-stretched arms. In front of the store, that gilded sign of Zoran's pranced and danced up and down, up and down. "Well then," Edith pepped herself up. "It's now or never." Edith swaggered along with summoned confidence and a myriad of scathing reprimands turning around her flustered mind. Her lips spoke silently in cadence with the words floating about her head, rehearsing the admonishments. She drove her way through the congested doorway. Each person she barged past had an orb in their grasp, preoccupied in casting seeings to one another, faces slack and passive. Edith scowled and huffed through her nose, sounding much like Zoran's mechanical crawler, she wagered. She cared not one jot. The cheek of them. She was unseen, unheard, simply unnoticed. That was the other thing that had been plaguing her. Nobody seemed to notice anyone unless they possessed an orb, which pretty much left her and old Wilb, who had lately ceased frequenting the hog's trotter altogether. The last time Edith had seen him, the old sea hound had complained that no one wanted to hear him no more. So she elbowed her way in, already smashing all those precious Orbinalls of Zoran's in her mind. Perhaps she would fling one upside his head too, for good measure. That would learn him for ruining her village. Ah! The proprietor of the Hog's Trotter. Edith, isn't it? Came a voice so silken smooth, so otherworldly, it had to be Zoran's. It was how Edith imagined a spider would sound to a fly as it wound a cocoon around it, assuring it that everything would be just fine. Zoran stood behind an obsidian counter decked out in purple and black, with that tall hat perched on his head at a jaunty angle. Below the shaded brim, his moustache twitched expectantly. About him and around the store, small mechanotechnical spiders puffed steam as they tottered around, with Orbinalls nestled on their backs from customer to customer. Edith shivered at the sight of the disturbing little contraptions. "So wonderful of you to finally visit my store. A pleasure," said Zoran, tipping his hat. "I won't be buying nothing, thank you," said Edith, trying not to take any notice of the creepy-crawling gadgets. "Not seeing as your blasted Orbinall bobs have put me right out of business." Edith folded her thick arms across her chest, glancing at outsiders perusing Orbinalls of varying sizes and colours, paying her no mind. Behind Zoran, a kind of net stretched from the floor to ceiling, looking for all the world like a giant's web. Zoran's arachnid assistants crawled up here and clung on there, clutching Orbinalls as though they were shimmering egg sacs. Zoran glided over to the web, legs working like a spider's, and his hands up in front, fingers treading the air with anticipation. He placed his hand beneath the mechanotechnical contraption, which seemed to sense his presence somehow, releasing the orb into his waiting palm. He handled the orb as though it were light as a dewdrop. With devilish dexterity, Zoran twirled it around his hand and up and down his forearm. It appeared for the world as though the orb was alive and moving of its own accord. So mesmerised was Edith that she felt outside her body, peering down upon the whole scene as if she had died and was now a lingering spirit. Despite the urge to applaud such dexterous feats, Edith remained stern in her countenance and rigid in her stance. She had resumed chewing her bottom lip again. "I ain't here to purchase none of them trinkets, nor likely I could afford one neither." Her gaze followed Zoran from the web back to the counter, where he allowed the orb to roll from his light grasp to the countertop. It came to an unnatural, abrupt stop, as though it had come against some imperceptible barrier, or perhaps wished to go no further. Curiosity threatened to steal Edith's determination for a second or two, until she managed to pry her gaze away. "I'm out of ale, and out of customers because of you and them things." She held her lips thin and tight after she spoke. It was the only way to keep her curiosity in check. She could feel her eyes straining against her urge to glance at the orb, as though the thing had some power over her. "I am sorry to hear of your sudden loss of profit, but I don't see how—" "Them things, I tell you." It was pulling her gaze, the orb. Down, down, down. She stabbed an accusing finger at the Orbinall resting impossibly motionless on the polished black counter. "Folk are seeing things all funny and wrong like they ain't actually in real life. It's not right." Orbinals merely enhance life experiences and enable the possessor to share the lives coupled with their emotions in an intimate and meaningful way. Have you seen this particular...
Told you once. Now I ain't telling you for the second time, young man.
She wagged an admonishing finger. Zoran's eyes flickered at her chiding words. Edith dared not glance down at the exquisite orb, which now held the most pleasing seeing of the hog's trotter. It was a street view, with astonishing lighting. The whole place seemed impossibly quaint. She brought her eyes up brusquely, suddenly ashamed for peeking as if accidentally witnessing someone's nakedness.
I'm here to ask, no, tell, you to stop, is all.
Zoran smiled. A laugh, derisive and condescending, escaped him. I am afraid I cannot stop, my dear. And with the utmost respect, I do not wish to. Can you not see the joy these little orbs bring? Edith regarded the pallid, expressionless faces around her. What on Sayadhan was he harping on about? Joy? Did the orbs cloud your vision so entirely that you even began to see the world as the orbs saw it, through some enchanted veil? Zoran whisked up the orb again and held it so when Edith returned her gaze to meet his, she looked directly into it. Seeings of Mrs. Bramble's bakery hovered there, such striking seeings. Delightful, or are they not? Said Zoran in that arachnid tone again. Place your hand but lightly on the Orbinall, and you will know the wonder of my latest advancement in Orbinall abilities. It was as if she were divided right then between giving this troublemaker Zoran a piece of her mind and, ooh. Holding the orb was even more magnificent than she had imagined it could be. Not only could it conjure the most alluring seeings, she could hear the thoughts that went along with them, could sense the emotions of the observer. This particular seeing she focused upon now, a charming depiction of a pint of ale, had the thought, enjoying a lovely pint down the hogs, twisting in her mind again and again, like a moth in spiralling flight around spellbinding candlelight. But the memory, the vision, whatever it was, felt old and stale. Wonderful! Zoran's voice danced in between the thoughts caught in the seeing. Fantastic! Such a delicious sensation, Edith, is it not? She felt herself nod. She was aware of the faintest movement, and then the seeings and those fluttering words were gone, replaced by Zoran's bone-white face, cut in half by that tremendous curling moustache. With the absence of the Orbinall, she picked up on a subtle torment she had not perceived before. Previously, the orb had dispersed her concerns, but now it was gone. She had the horrid sensation of them creeping back. Edith snatched the Orbinall. Zoran withdrew it even further.
Is it expensive?
She asked, retracting and rubbing her hand as though it were sore from being slapped away. Oh, not in the slightest, said Zoran, twisting his moustache. Not one jot. A coin of silver is all. The coin was spinning on the counter, and Edith was halfway down the hectic street before she comprehended what had transpired. A lingering thought, some nagging thing nipped at the heels of her memory as she failed to recall why she had even visited Zoran in the first place. Other than to purchase an orb, that is. A few moon sweeps later, and things were back as they should be by Edith's reckoning. Well, almost exactly. Will was sat telling his stories in the usual place at the bar once more, except now he thought his tales into an Orbinall. It was the one Edith had convinced him to purchase shortly after she had acquired hers. Now everyone in the village, and beyond listened to old Wilb's thinkings, sending him loves and laughs and pats on the back through his Orbinall. Wilb had even taken to paying for his ale, now that he had coin coming in through sales of his own handcrafted flagons. Why on Seodan anyone actually bought the ugly things was beyond Edith, yet they did. The Hog's Trotter saw a roaring trade from locals and outsiders, including the mighty Usk who regularly frequented the place after hunting Midites in the mountains. Edith had increased her own brewing activities and employed a few local folk to help keep up with demand. She had taken up importing casks of foreign ales too, which came in by tall ship via Sandbach Bay. The day a new ale came to the Hog's Trotter was quite an event. There would be the tasting and the naming of the ale, and one hell of an ease-up to boot. Edith was now hurrying, preparing food along with her newly hired kitchen helpers, sublime dishes. Food that would be exhibited so meticulously on the plate it would merit many sharings. Previous responses had prompted her to update her plates to beautifully glazed ceramic ones she had imported from the elite Sulphurin city of Lore. Edith had spruced up the tavern a little too. In fact, she found herself making all kinds of additions she had never felt inclined to do before. Her Orbinall was to thank for that. Oh, the insight it brought. Thoughts folk never uttered. Edith sometimes wondered if they were even aware they were thinking such things. Did they comprehend that everybody could listen in on them? Did she, really, for that matter? Edith sometimes came over embarrassed at her own ignorance. But what did it matter? There was no harm in it, was there? Not all the thoughts that tottered over the orbs were positive, though. Folk seemed to argue about all sorts of nonsense these days. Issues that really did not merit the energy, yet it appeared to Edith that the more absurd the argument, the more people shared it. Folk seemed willing to do just about anything to secure more approval. For the Hog's Trotter it meant Edith had to invent new pies and pastries and cunning ways of plating it all up. For others it was to share seeings of humorous occasions or unfortunate accidents or blunders around the village. Some folk had even taken to staging their own amusing accidents, of which Edith did not approve. Though Edith did have a fondness for the seeings of cute, fluffy little cotticks, with thoughts such as "hang in there" and "believe" floating along with them. She even had a painting made up with "Never give up" scrawled beneath a determined-looking cottick trying to get in to a jar of pickles, which she had hung in the kitchen to encourage her helpers through busy nights. Plating up 3 meals ready to go, Edith paused and felt around in her apron pocket until her fingers found her Orbinall. It did well to keep it close to her, she had discovered. Once she had left it on the counter to go out back and grab a keg of ale. She had come over all woozy in that instant. It only took a couple of occurrences like that before she managed to put 2 and 2 together. Holding the orb in one hand, she angled herself to get a good view of all 3 plates and blinked rapidly. Straightening, she gazed into the alluring golden hue of her Orbinall until the seeings manifested. Obliterating with decisive swipes the ones which did not satisfy her, she narrowed it down to 2 seeings and then finally 1. Edith sent it on with warm thoughts and, just serving up a little something, trailing after it. She heard a unanimous "ooh" from beyond the bar and sighed with satisfaction as calls for more food came fluttering into her orb. Nobody ordered anything with actual words anymore, but with thoughts and feelings transmitted through the Orbinalls. Some patrons who ordered might not even be in the tavern, but out in Ensom somewhere. Edith had had to hire the sprightly Starno's droves to deliver food and ale on her behalf. In a rush of excitement to get the food out and to see to the next orders, Edith fumbled her Orbinall. She could have sworn blind her hand was in her pouch. The orb slid down her apron front before she could correct the action and smashed into crystal shards on the unforgiving stone floor of the overburdened kitchen. A cloud of sour-smelling greenish mist came up and quickly vanished. The jolt she felt inside herself was instant. Such a severe, callous pain. Edith tumbled backwards. She fought to steady herself on the thick, cleaver-gnarled butchering table, but instead found herself sinking through it. She shrieked as she attempted to bring herself to her feet, falling forward onto all fours. No one heard. Her hands! Her translucent hands! She was holding them in front of her face, staring right through them at the far wall where tarnished pots and pans hung on hooks. She swallowed hard, straining to keep the rising panic down, but it was no good. She called out to her kitchen helpers, but none of them seemed to even notice her. Edith dashed into the bar in desperation, to be seen and heard. No one saw.